Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. We're starting this morning with more evidence of extraordinary atrocities by the Russians, building on the war crimes that we found out over the weekend. A bombing of a train station with thousands of people trying to leave the Donbass, 50 dead already, 100 wounded, and probably many more to come. Then we will look at what the European political scene looks like after the elections in Hungary and Serbia brought two people who are as close to Vladimir Putin as anyone is back to power. And finally, we'll take a look at the French elections, which will start this weekend with the first round of vote, and we'll see how that pans out. Here to discuss all of this with us this week is Philip Stevens, who is joining us from Florence. Philip is a contributing editor of the Financial Times. Philip, wonderful to see you.
Great to see you.
Also from Paris, Sylvie Kauffmann, who's the editorial director of Le Monde. Sylvie, wonderful to have you for the show for the first time.
Hi, great to be with you. Thank you.
And from Washington, D.C., Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. bureau chief of the Straits Times. Nirmal, wonderful to have you here as well. Nirmal, let's start with you, sort of on Ukraine. Of course, we've been talking on the show constantly about what's happening, but bring us up to date about where we are with regard to the status in Ukraine. Lots happening in terms of seeing what the Russians are doing to civilian populations, but also changes in the military situation. And more sanctions that are coming forward. So bring us up to date, Nirmal, about where we are and what should we be looking for?
Yes, thank you, Ivo. And it's so nice to be back with all of you, although, of course, it's a way more unstable world. So as we know, the White House this week announced a new round of sanctions. They targeted two of Russia's biggest banks, Sberbank and Alfa Bank, plus the two adult daughters, interestingly, of President Vladimir Putin, plus sanctions on the United Shipbuilding Corporation, a huge state-owned enterprise, its subsidiaries, some of its board of directors, also the state-controlled diamond mining company, Alrosa. So let's look into this. Sberbank holds about 1/3 of Russia's total banking assets. Alfa Bank is the country's fourth largest financial institution. U.S. Treasury said these transactions with these two need to wind down through April 12 and May 5, respectively. But energy transactions are exempted. And that's a big but. The uncomfortable truth is that Russia's energy revenues, from all I've been looking at and reading, and these include taxes on mineral extraction, export duties, and so forth, they're apparently doing fine. As we know, one of the problems is Europe continues to buy billions of dollars worth of Russian oil and gas. So Western economies are in a bit of a bind. And here in the US, the Biden administration politically cannot afford inflation to go higher on the back of higher oil prices. So the truth is that oil and gas remain relatively untouched. I saw one estimate that Russia gets something like $1 billion a day from oil and gas. And Russia is also not entirely cut off from the international financial system. It is not isolated. It also has working relations with China and India. It's not entirely isolated. This does not mean, of course, that these countries, China and India, are okay with the war. I think it is seen over in Asia as a cautionary tale at many levels, but they have their own strategic interests. So there is no real global consensus on how to deal with it. And while the Russian economy is hurting, I think we already expect a growth contraction of 15% in this year, minus 15. The financial system appears to be doing okay. The ruble is nearly back to pre-war levels. It goes up and down depending on all these sanctions and all that, but it's doing okay. And meanwhile, the mood in DC in particular seems generally hawkish. The war crimes aspect is very disturbing. There appears to be no doubt, and it would not be surprising either, that war crimes have been committed. But the rhetoric from the administration here, calling Putin personally a butcher and a war criminal, that regime change remark, which President Biden, he didn't use that actual phrase, but it was walked back. But nevertheless, it is out there. Now, all this leaves not much room for negotiation. And sanctioning Putin's daughters seems unnecessarily vindictive and personal. And the argument apparently is that he parks his wealth with family members. But they don't seem to have any direct part in this war. So the point is, the rhetoric is harsh, and some of these sanctions are very personal. And it is hard to see either side now walking away with something they want. It is very likely that this war will go on for months, maybe even years. It is stalemated, and there is no basis for a lasting peace agreement. Putin needs something to show for all this effort in blood and treasure. The theory now, of course, is that he wants to take the whole of Donbass and keep it. So at best, we are looking at an unfinished war, leaving root causes unaddressed and new levels of enmity, which we could see manifested in many different ways. Cyber attacks, for instance. And as for the war crimes, unless Putin is actually brought down from power, which is possible but remains unlikely, there is very little chance that he will be actually dragged anywhere and put on trial for war crimes. And while on the subject of the fallout and end games, to me, there have been two primary casualties from this, apart from the obvious security implications for Europe, which is completely upended. So these are climate targets and nuclear non-proliferation. Let's take one example, Japan. Japan is beginning to think its pacifist constitution is a problem. It's in a very heavily armed neighborhood. It still doesn't have an actual peace treaty with Russia, which has something like close to 6,000 nuclear warheads. China will have probably up to 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. North Korea has about 20. So Japan recognizes the one China principle, but it is worried that an invasion of Taiwan by China will bring China to its backyard. So Japan is in a bind. Does it carry on with the status quo and see these neighbors expand their spheres of influence? Now, the problem is Japan itself suffers a trust deficit with its neighbors. Any attempt at beefing up security will bring back memories of Japanese imperialism. So the bottom line, though, is that Japan will be spending more on defense. So will the US, so will many in Europe, and most significantly, Germany, as I'm sure you've all been discussing. So we are already in a global arms race, and it is not going to get any better. So I think I'll stop there, because there's lots of very important issues that you raised. Let's Sylvie, let's stick to the sanctions for a minute, because of course the Europeans also levied the fifth package of sanctions in response, really, to the news from Bucha over the weekend. But this one seemed to be a little bit more difficult to come together than the previous sanctions. Tell us a little bit about the internal debate in Europe, and where do you think particularly the gas and oil issue, which President Macron put on the table earlier this week, is heading when we're thinking about the European Union moving forward on sanctions further?
Yes, of course, the further you go on sanctions, the more difficult it gets to have 27 member states to agree with each other. So fifth package, as you said. So now we are getting into really the hard work. And the hard work is oil and gas. So we got coal, but oil and gas are going to be really the very difficult issues. And what do we see already? Hungary, and that we will talk about it later on. But Hungary is, saying, no, we're not going to touch gas, and already also saying it's ready to pay in rubles for its imports, which the other member states have refused to do. This is one of the demands of Putin. Yes, we do have problems coming up here, which was not unexpected, but it will be they will have to be dealt with. And of course, we have Germany, which still relies on Russia for 55% of its gas consumption. So some countries, notably the Baltic states, have already decided to cut completely their dependency on Russian gas and oil. But some of them, like Lithuania, had been preparing for this for years already. Others are, accelerating the process, like Estonia and Latvia, and will do it. Will achieve this. Will complete the process quite soon. But for big countries like Germany, of course, it's more complicated. It's difficult. First, it is difficult to enact because they were not prepared at all. And it is also difficult politically, let's face it. We have seen quite fascinating statements over the past few days from Germany, from German politicians, for instance, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who started to kind of soul searching about Germany's Russian policy towards Russia. But it's not enough to say we were wrong and we didn't see this coming. You also have to draw the conclusions from this self-criticism, and it's quite fascinating because you have German politicians, and not only SPD, the Social Democrats, but also a former the economic advisor of Angela Merkel, saying, we never suspected that Putin could act against its own the own interest of his country, and that implies a level of rationality, which is understandable, but of course seems a little bit naive retrospectively now. So we're in the middle of this process in Europe. Some are going further than others, but as among 27 members, it's always a little bit difficult.
Yeah, and even so, the 27 members have done a pretty remarkable set of sanctions already. So, it is, as you rightly said, as you get further, it becomes more difficult. That's clearly the case. Philip, clearly there is the question of how do you maintain Western unity, but there's also the question of where this conflict is going. And particularly where you think the Russians are going. You wrote in your excellent Substack newsletter, Inside Out, about that any hope that Putin is going to give up, even though he is focusing now on the East, is misplaced. Why do you think Putin is going to continue, and what does that really mean for how we address the fundamental issue that still resides with us, which is a war in the middle of Europe?
Okay. Well, I think in the short term, I mean, on sanctions, just very quickly, I think the pressure with each of these horrific crimes by the Russians, I think the pressure on sanctions is going to build, and I wouldn't be surprised if Germany actually shifts its position if we go on like this. I think the pressure is really building now. I think in the very short term, what Ukraine desperately needs is more military support from NATO. What's happening is that the Russian army, defeated on the outskirts of Kiev, is now regrouping, moving to the southeast to launch what promises to be a pretty fearful assault on the areas of the Donbass that it doesn't hold. Ukrainians desperately need, one, to get their forces there, but two, more heavy weapons, armor as well. They actually need fighting weapons as well as. So I think the plea is directly to NATO at the moment, and I think it will be pivotal what the US provides, what the UK and what others provide in the next few days, because I think within a week we're going to see another pretty major battle in Ukraine. In the longer medium term, you still have in Europe these sort of what I call self-styled realists who are saying we have to negotiate with Putin and that all wars have to end in a negotiated settlement and we have to think about compromises. But I think the sort of scales are beginning to fall away now, and people are beginning to look at what Putin's done, what he said in the past about the very existence of Ukraine, his determination to tear up the European security order and shift to a system where Russia reestablishes its sort of suzerainty in the former Soviet space. And I think people are just beginning to realize that this isn't someone we're going to be able to negotiate as a rational actor at the end of this. And what I hope is beginning to happen is that people are saying, look, what the absolute priority is that he's defeated in Ukraine and that we do equip we're not going to fight ourselves, but we can equip the Ukrainian forces, which have proved much better than the Russian forces, to win and to force Putin to withdraw. But then we have to look, I think, medium to long term about translating sanctions into a permanent regime of restraint on trade, transfer of technology, and other things. I think we can't look at sanctions anymore as something that we've put on because the war's going on and will take away if and when the war ends. I think we're going to have to look at Russia under Putin, and it's Putin's regime, not the Russian people this is directed at, and say, as long as they have a leader who, with these ambitions, with this ruthlessness and recklessness in the pursuit of those ambitions, we are going to have to contain Russia. And we are going to have to put in place the sort of structures we had in the Cold War, the sort of deterrent structures from NATO, the economic structures which will limit trade permanently, which will block the transfer of technology. And we're going to have to wait it out, because there's no negotiation that's going to settle this war in Ukraine and be stable as long as Putin's in power. And I think, there'll always be so-called realists, but I think as I said in my piece, the realists have really lost touch with reality. The reality is that Putin is determined to overturn the sort of post-war order.
Sylvie, I'm interested in how not only you see it, but whether you think the key European leaders, starting with President Macron, sees it in this way. He has always said that Russia needs to be part of the security order, and of course has spent more time trying to interact with Putin both before and since the war started than almost any other European leader. What is he trying to achieve, and what is his understanding of the conflict? Does he share Philip's view, or
Yeah, just before that, if I may, there's one thing I wanted to say, following up with Philip's remarks on weapons deliveries. There's a threshold to which the supposed red line of non-belligerent status this threshold is becoming more and more difficult to respect, right? And the pressure, Philip was talking about the pressure which is increasing from public opinion as events are, as Russian attacks are more and more tragic and bloody. And I think we see already this pressure translating into an upper level of weapons being delivered. For instance, the Czechs are now delivering tanks. Slovakia just announced that it had provided Ukraine with an anti-air system S-300, which is Russian-made, I understand. So this is something we may have. This process may be accelerating as well. Regarding Macron and Putin, yes, Macron always had this view that the security, European architecture of security was in tatters, and it had to be completely rethought and renegotiated, and that's why he wanted to have this dialogue with Putin. That was 2-3 years ago when he started this very, very controversial initiative. Which led nowhere, of course, because now he probably realizes that Putin never had this in mind and never shared this perspective. So now he has a totally different dialogue, if I may call it dialogue, because it's not really a dialogue, but a conversation maybe with Putin. They haven't talked, interestingly enough, they haven't talked since Bucha, since the massacres were disclosed, and I think partly because of disgust and disapproval, and also partly because we are running into the election. So we have the first round on Sunday, so this would have become too controversial. But I think now he's really reached a dead end in his contacts with Putin. He is adamant that somebody's got to keep talking to Putin, that somebody in the West needs to keep a line of dialogue open. or a line of contact, because it may be useful later if we have to negotiate this kind of framework of, Cold War-like or whatever comes up or is negotiable. And he has the supports not only of President Zelensky in this, but also I think of most Western leaders. So it's a difficult task. Nobody knows whether it's going to lead anywhere. And I think it's really, at least in Paris, nobody's really daring to say what will be the future. What Philippe was describing, we're stuck in another stage of the war at the moment. And I don't see people, at least in the Elysee, not at the moment, thinking that far ahead.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Nirmal, just to come back to you before we move on to the next subject, I think even that's true in Washington. It's not really clear to me how the long-term thinking is progressing. It's very much about punitive responses that you're seeing, driven by the moment, as opposed to sort of a longer-term strategy, other than this larger issue of democracy versus autocracy, which, of course, President Biden talked about has been talking about all along, but in his Warsaw speech. Do you, talking to folks in Washington as you walk around, do you get a sense that there is more longer-term thinking along the lines that Philip talked about and others have been writing about?
Probably not, actually. I mean, you're right. I think the DC establishment is still sort of stuck in this between options of making the Russian economy suffer. The standard suite of options: bring the economy down to its knees, and then the population will rise up, or there'll be a palace coup, and the leader will be taken down, and everything will change. But it usually doesn't actually work out that way. As I said earlier, Russia's economy is sort of it's on contract for sure, but there's no sign of the population. I mean, there's protests and this and that, but there's no sign of huge protests against Putin because they don't even know what's going on. The Russian media ecosystem is it's such a feedback loop that they are just getting a lot of propaganda, which and they believe that this is a rightful, just war and all that for a whole bunch of their own reasons. I don't think there is that much long-term thinking right now in Washington on this. I think they're stuck in this punitive, in a punitive mode right now. The idea is, of course, it's a legitimate idea: stop the war, stop the refugees, stop the hostilities. But it's not happening, and these sanctions are not going to do it.
Yeah, it's not likely to happen anytime soon, I think, as Philip and others, and Jens Stoltenberg and even the NATO Secretary General and Jake Sullivan said, the National Security Advisor earlier this week said it's all going to be months and months of protracted war, which is unfortunate. Let's switch, Philip, to elections that happened over the weekend, which we've talked a lot over the last 6 weeks how much Europe has changed. And we talked today also about the changes in French perspective in Germany. Two countries didn't change a lot, at least if you look at the elections, Hungary and Serbia, which overwhelmingly re-elected. Now, I put elections a little bit in quotation marks because there's a real question about how free and fair these elections were. But there was at least a lot of popular support for President Vučić and Prime Minister Orban to be reelected. How should we understand this? Is this a beginning of a longer term trend that being pro-Putin in Europe is not as bad as people thought it was?
Well, I'm not quite sure it's being pro-Putin, but it's certainly a reminder that Europe has its populist problems, drift in some countries towards illiberal democracy from the liberal democracy that we expect, and indeed Viktor Orban boasts in Hungary that it's become a liberal democracy. What that means, of course, is that the government is taking more control of the media, of the judiciary. There's less respect respect for the rule of law. But he won and Vucic won, and I think they won not by saying they were great supporters of Putin, although Orban has been particularly vocal. Vucic's been a little bit more careful, but by saying we're going to keep our countries out of the war. So the message that Orban and Vucic said was, look, it's not our war. We're not having arms coming through here. We're not going to be part of. But I mean, so far, Orban has gone along with the EU sanctions, whether, as you know, as was said, whether he would go along with oil and gas sanctions is another question. But it's also a reminder that if we try and frame this conflict as one between the democracies and the authoritarian states, we're going to have some awkward moments, as it were, as points, because you know we have one authoritarian state in the EU, another waiting to get into the EU. How are we going to deal with it? So I actually would think I would sort of frame the contest not so much as between democracies and authoritarian states as between status quo powers, people who want to keep the present international order, and those revisionist powers who want to overturn it. And that allows you a little bit of room. But I think that we shouldn't necessarily despair, although when we talk about France later, I might have to change my mind if Sylvie thinks Le Pen is going to win in France. But I think Orban has won, but it's a very small country. What we've also seen is a split in this axis that he'd established with Poland, which also has a rather instinctively authoritarian government, but is virulently anti-Putin. So the sort of Hungarian-Polish axis has broken. And I think the Serbians have to be quite careful because they do want to be part of the EU. And the one thing that apart from the elections, the other thing that's happened this week is that the European Commission is going to, as said, it's announced the procedure, which could, it's the rule of law procedure, which could deprive Hungary of billions, literally billions and billions of euros of EU support that it desperately needs. So I wouldn't be surprised in Hungary if over coming weeks and months, as Orban tries to hold on to that money, we see him moving a little bit back into the centre ground. I think on oil and gas and whether there would be sanctions, I think if the EU wants to find a way, it will find a way without Hungary, if necessary, to do it. But this is, as I said, we have to be a little bit careful if we're talking about the world dividing between democracies and authoritarian states, because as during the Cold War, sometimes the democracies are going to have to sit alongside and form alliances of convenience with states that we don't particularly respect for their political systems. So I think a better, as I say, division is between revisionist states and status quo states. So big truth behind all this is that it's not straightforward. We don't have a world in which we have the good people all on one side and the bad people all on the other. There's a big middle there, a blurred middle, and we've got to think about where other states fit there.
Nirmal, before I get to Sylvie and broaden it out to the French elections, I want to pick up a point you made early on, which I think is very relevant to what Philip said, which is there's a large part of the world that is not choosing sides. Even in the UN vote yesterday to kick Russia out of the Human Rights Council, 58 countries abstained and 24 voted against that resolution, most of whom are in Africa and Latin America. So that swath too. Other interesting statistic that I just heard is although 7 of the 10 largest economies have imposed sanctions on Russia, only 1 of the 10 most populous states has done so, and that's the United States. Lots of other countries haven't done this. So I wonder, would a framing of status quo versus revisionist power be more likely to persuade a country like India or the countries of Africa or Latin America to be more willing to oppose the revisionism that is coming from Russia, or is their dependence on Russia, or their, in case of Africa, the disinformation that the Russians are passing around, that this is all a colonial war by the United States, not going to be enough? How do you see it? You spend time thinking about this, and in your area in Southeast Asia, this is of course another big issue.
Yeah. As far as Asia is concerned, I don't know that much about Africa, except of course Russia has all these historical ties in many parts of Africa. But in Asia, it's a question of, you can't wish away geography, right? We all know that. China has this enormous border with Russia, and they have to have a working relationship. They can't, they can't change that in a hurry at all. Why would they? India gets 70% of its weaponry from Russia. Vietnam, somewhat similar. So India also believes that it is big enough to have its own strategic autonomy. It has some historical record with Russia coming to its aid before, when India was, the subject of isolation back in the early 70s, for example. But and Russia does not have designs. It may have designs on the old Soviet Union states, but obviously no territorial designs on China and India. Obviously not. So India does not want to be seen as overtly sort of falling into the arms of the United States. It's part of the old non-aligned principle as well, right? The strategic autonomy and non-alignment. So I think the big lesson, it's a huge cautionary tale, of course, and which is why countries like Singapore, India even condemned it, abstained on these UN votes, but it condemned the Bucha massacre. Singapore was the only ASEAN country which actually fell in line and put some sanctions on Russia on the principle that you can't just gobble up a small state, right? So for small countries, this is the whole episode is extremely alarming in principle, but they have to deal with the realities of geography. Again, if you look at Southeast Asia, the big thing is, US has a balance in Indo-Pacific. ASEAN is supposed to have centrality in that. How does ASEAN interact with China? Well, as they are fond of saying in ASEAN, China has been a neighbor of half of ASEAN for 2,000 years, and it's going to be a neighbor for the next 2,000 years. The view from a great distance is vastly different from the view from a few hundred miles from the Chinese border, right? So the same thing applies in terms of Russia. This is seen as a European fight. The great danger is all these fissures, all these root causes are left unaddressed, wherever they may be, whether it's Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, or in this case now Europe. It's not a good augur for the future.
Sylvie, if you want to comment on this, please do. But then I want to turn to the election and get your perspective of what's happening. The race is tightening very quickly. A lot of us are starting to get the anxiety that we had when the Brexit vote was getting too tight, or the US presidential vote was getting too tight in 2016. We've had many surprises. Are we in for a surprise in France, or how do you see what's happening on that score with the election? First round, of course, on Sunday. Second round, 2 weeks after.
Yeah, as you say, the anxiety is rising over the past 3 days, really. I mean, it was a very boring campaign. In a way, there was no campaign at all. That's really quite unprecedented in the Fifth Republic in France. Usually the presidential campaign is a very lively moment, and it's a moment of democratic debate in France. And this hasn't happened so far because of COVID-19 in a way, but most of all because of the war in Ukraine, which has completely overshadowed this campaign. And so we had this very interesting phenomenon that Macron assumed that he didn't have to campaign because he was the statesman. He was the wartime leader. He was involved in all these summits, G7, NATO, EU, and talking to Putin and Zelensky on the phone. And people were riveted by what was happening in Ukraine. But then something happened, which is that people started to realize that this war was not only a geopolitical and humanitarian disaster, but it had also economic consequences, including on their wallet. And with the rising prices of petrol, of gas, and of food prices also, it started to become an issue. And one candidate grasped this very clearly, and that was Marine Le Pen. And she saw that quite early and managed to, she pushed this issue of cost of living at the forefront of her campaign, and it proved very efficient. So over the past few days, her polls numbers have really risen to the point that, and Macron's numbers have fallen down to the point that now today they're only 3.5 points apart. The gap has really narrowed to the margin of error, really. So that's why we're talking about anxiety. Macron finally threw himself into battle and has started to campaign, but I think he's really lost momentum. The dynamic is completely on Marine Le Pen's side. Interestingly enough, also, her rival on the far right, Éric Zemmour, who was really the big phenomenon a month ago or so, has crashed down, because that's something very irrational, but it's quite interesting. Both Éric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen are Putinophiles, in fact. They were pro-Putin and pro-Russia. But again, very deftly, Marine Le Pen managed to put a smoke screen on this, and again, pushing this issue of the cost of living. She managed to have people forget about this, while Éric Zemmour, stood his ground, said refugees were not welcome. He completely misjudged the public mood. And so that was a disaster for him. And Marine Le Pen has benefited from this, because there has been a transfer from in the polls from Zemmour to Marine Le Pen. So here we are, 2 days before the first round. We were talking about Hungary and Poland earlier, and a Polish friend earlier reminded me of something which is not a good omen at all either, which is the campaign of 2015 in Poland with President Komorowski, who was he was the incumbent, center-right politician, democratic politician, excellent democratic credentials, friend of Donald Tusk, and he was so sure of his victory that 3 weeks before election, one of his advisors, I remember, said, the question is not whether Komorowski will be re-elected, but whether he will win in the first or second round. And in fact, he was beaten. He was defeated in the first round by Andrzej Duda of PiS, right? And PiS is still in power. So, so this friend was telling me, are you having this Komorowski moment in France? I hope we are not, because the consequences for Europe and probably for the world, but, for the European Union would be a total disaster. It would be the destabilization of European Union. Of course, Orban would have a great ally in Paris. In Poland, Philip was talking about this decoupling, I don't know if you use this word, but, the decoupling of Budapest and Warsaw. And I think it's only up to a point. On Russia, definitely. I think they agree to disagree on Russia, but on the issue of the rule of law, there's no progress being made in Warsaw. So, we will have a totally different situation. And I really hope, fortunately, we have a second round. And so these 2 weeks apart from between the first and second round will hopefully show the right way to the French voters.
Thanks, Sylvie. That's just great. I think it sets it up both really well. In those 2 weeks, the dynamics can always change, but clearly, Philip, you must be looking at this and say, I've seen this movie before. And most times it didn't end in the way you wanted to. So, I mean, talk a little bit about, I mean, of course, your own perspective on the election, but also what would the impact be of Le Pen winning on, you know, the last 6 weeks have changed the world, but this one would really change things pretty dramatically as well when you think about Europe and its standing.
Well, it's a terrible thing to say, but I think Boris Johnson would probably be pleased if Le Pen won, because he's himself has made it clear. I mean, Viktor Orban's been one of the very few, although German Chancellor's there today, visitors to number 10. Anglo-French relations are in a terrible condition at the moment. He has much of the sort of many of the same populist instincts as Le Pen. He's not quite as tough on immigration, but you know that they're in the same sort of ballpark. But it would be absolutely terrible for Europe, and I'm putting my faith actually in the hard left in France, because the sort of candidate running third is this chap Mélenchon, who's a sort of far left candidate who's been running in more presidential elections than I can remember, and his supporters, a lot of whom came from the former Socialist Party, had been saying before that, you know, they wouldn't under any circumstances vote for Macron in the second round. I think the prospect that Le Pen could actually win, now I hope Sylvie's not going to tell me I'm wrong here, may galvanize some of these voters of the left and say, however much we detest Macron, and they really do detest him on the left, we cannot surrender France into the hands of the far right in order to spite Macron. So that's my hope. So my hope is that after this first round, if you like, people will say this is really a serious election now. And they will have seen, look what happened to Brexit, look what happened in the US. We can't let that happen in France. So I'm going to be hopeful.
You're putting your faith in the French voters. Of course, the voters, the Mélenchon voters, are attracted to the same bread and butter issues that Le Pen has now put forward as a main part of her platform. She's been very, very smart, as Sylvie said. Sylvie, do you see the left saying, closing their nose and being willing to vote for Macron because Le Pen's just worked? How do you think?
Well, if Philippe's hopes rely on the hard left in France, you see where we got, right? That gives you an idea of the mess we're into. Yes, I mean, logically, this is what everybody hopes. I mean, everybody, rational people hope. You know, there's this level of detestation that Philippe mentioned, which is real. It's a strange phenomenon, but a lot of people who and not only on the hard left, but on a lot of center-left people who voted for Macron in 2017 now say, you know, if it's again in the runoff Macron against Le Pen, I will stay at home. I'm not going to vote for any of them. And so, yes, and you know, what we call le Front Républicain, this reaction of Republican people who believe in democracy and who, you know, at the last minute will say, no, okay, let's be reasonable and let's go to vote even, you know, if we hate this guy. Yes, that's the hope we have. But you know, as we said, there have been precedents in the US, not only in Poland, but in the US and in Britain, which are not so nice. Yeah, so we'll see.
Well, we'll be watching the election returns on Sunday, and of course, 2 weeks from Sunday, when the final vote will be counted. I want to thank Sylvie Kauffmann, Nirmal Ghosh, and Philip Stevens for yet another insightful look at the news from the world. And want to thank all of you for watching and tuning in. And we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Great to
Thank
talk to
you.
you. Bye.